Welcome to Talentless, the podcast that's all HR, all talent, and zero fluff. Hosted by industry talent leaders Desiree Goldie and Ashley King, and made for recruiters who think of talent outside of the box. They're here to dig into the heart of what makes workplaces tick and sometimes blow up. They are not afraid to get into the messy, the meaningful, and the downright motivating. So buckle up, because they're here to make you the best in the business. Now, let's get to work.
Gosh, I cannot believe who we have on this show today, Ashley.
Woo, woo.
Can you believe it?
Nope.
Can you believe it? I am super excited. We are glad to have Jeremy Lyons here, good friend of mine, doing great things in the RecOps space. And you know what? I'm just going to stop and read his bio really, really quick, because I think it's important for you guys to know what authority he brings to this topic. Jeremy Lyons is a recognized authority and tireless advocate in the RecOps TA Ops space, dedicated to elevating industry awareness, methodology, career development, and strategic implementation. His extensive, which by the way they are, contributions include co-founding RecOps Collective, a premier consultancy and advisory firm specializing in recruitment operations, serving as chief editor of the RecOps Roundup. If you don't know it, please subscribe. The industry's most influential newsletter, developing and leading training for RecOps, the most comprehensive and widely adopted RecOps specific GPT OpenAI store. Also use it, earning the unofficial title of most likely to get you to say RecOps 5 times. Oh my God, it's a joke.
Hey, I had to slip something in there.
I said RecOps way too many times. So I did say, Jeremy got me. He wanted me to say it 5 times. I did say RecOps a lot in a bio. I do want to note that behind his, beyond his professional endeavors, Jeremy is just a good spirit and a good human. My career has been elevated by him, but he can be also found pursuing physical fitness, practicing his Japanese language skills, and nurturing his personal relationships. Jeremy, I don't think you know this, but my minor in college was Japanese.
I did not. I love when I can get on a podcast and a recording and something new catches my attention like that. We'll have to say some Japanese for the end if you remember any of it, because I certainly
We will. Jeremy, this is always a really good question for me, because I think about how people go into their careers. They fell into recruiting, they fell into talent. But give me the headline of your career in 6 words or less. Can you do it?
I don't know if I can do it, but what I will say is this. I will correct anybody who says they fell into recruiting to say they discovered recruiting instead, because I think we've done far too much of a disservice to the recruiting space to say that you can just fall into it, because we don't hear people say, well, I fell into being a doctor, or I fell into being a software engineer, or I fell into, something like that. And I think that we need to talk about recruiting as a space that actually has technical skills and things that have been learned over time that make what we do more efficient and better than just sort of saying, hey, anybody can do this, anybody can pick this up, that this is sort of, I come from being a teacher and hearing the whole, those who can't do teach piece. It's like, no, the people who teach, you need a whole different skill set. And I think that's sort of something I would say about recruiting. But I think that I would also throw this in there too. I got into the recruiting operations space because I married my parents' skills of, my dad in show business doing unit production manager producing work, which means he has to know all of the back end of a TV set. And in order to know the back end, you have to know the front end. And my mother, who is an executive recruiter, married their skills even though they got divorced. But the thing that I tell people all the time was I got into this space because people kept saying, and this is now going on 10 years ago, that recruiting is broken, that hiring is broken. And I think that for a lot of people, there was we're using that to solve for a point solution problem within the recruiting process. Absolutely. Instead of zooming out and looking at it as there is a system here and the system itself has issues. And in order to fix those issues, we have to fix the system. And we have to institutionalize those fixes so that you're not just sort of sitting there beating somebody over the head with like, do this thing and do this thing better. You get people to not think about what they're doing, but just do the right thing every time repeatedly. And if you notice that people can't do that, then how do you automate what they're doing in order to get you to do the right thing? And I think that is fundamentally core to like what I do and how I do it and how I think about recruiting operations versus other people who are just like, oh, you need to fix the offer process, bada bing, bada boom, we just fixed it. Because you have to go back to like what got us here, and you have to go back to first principles and understanding what are our problems. And in order to do that, you have to have a systems mindset. And I think that's something that's really been new and been different for the recruiting operations space going on. I want to say maybe about 4 years, people have started to talk about it more actively. And we're starting to hear more and more people talk about the product manager mindset that you need to have within recruiting operations now.
Yeah, I absolutely love it because I think there is like this moment that rec ops becomes a little sexier as we move forward and becomes the heartbeat of how we move forward, right? And because I do think there's a data point for everything. And as someone who came from talent and rec ops, that's how Jeremy and I know each other, is that there is this like data point of saying, this is the problem you have. How do you solve that problem? And I don't think that was always diagnosed originally. And I think it was just like throw talent at it. And Ashley, who is a great believer in all of these things, I'm gonna kind of shut up and let her talk a little bit more. But I think there is this data point that you almost can nerd out on this stuff. And if you get really deep into it, it is so important. It is like the essential reason you should be doing talent. Does that resonate? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I might say is that if you got into talent to do data or think about the data, then that's probably a very interesting
well,
course.
I kind of did,
Um,
Jeremy. I'm just saying.
I'm not I'm not saying that data is, you don't need data. You don't need to have some data knowledge here. I'm just sort of saying if you were a person who came out and you said, you know what, I really want to do data, and then you worked your way into HR roles to focus more on data, there might have been other places that are a little bit more data. Maybe they have structured data a little bit differently. Maybe it's a little bit more focused on the data than our space. Not to say that there aren't elements of what we do that require a heavy amount of data knowledge. And I think that's another reason why people discover the talent space
Yeah.
or even people ops space is you're looking at data, but it keeps you maybe a little bit more grounded because the numbers that you're seeing are people. So it's you can stay sort of within your humanity there to be like, yes, we've got 10,000 applications, and even though that is huge volume, we might want to go back and think about what we're doing with those 10,000 applications. That's 10,000 individual stories, and those stories are all connected back. So what you're talking about there isn't necessarily 10,000 applicants. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that are now connected to your company in very different ways because people talk about the companies that they're applying to and people talk about their stories. And especially if you're a B2C company, you want to provide that great candidate experience because you never know what somebody might do when they're like, hey, you know what, like, I had a really crappy experience with X company and I don't want to buy their products. And most people might just be like, hey, look, I'm going to join you. I'm not going to buy their products anymore.
Yeah,
So what does
absolutely.
that do? What does that tell you? And so that adds to the compoundingness of the story.
Also, I don't know if we had a challenge to get you to say data more than 10 times in one sentence, but if we did, we've totally
But
won.
you definitely do.
Yeah, we totally whooped you.
We owe you a shirt.
Yeah, we do owe you a shirt. I counted the
I
data.
mean, do we turn it into a drinking game at some point?
Honestly, I think you're late. I think I already did. I didn't know y'all weren't. My bad. Uh,
This is water, by the way,
yeah,
everybody.
we'll sniff it and see. Okay, it's all clear. Actually, one of those individuals. So my minor for my master's is in behavioral research and statistical analysis. So data of people is my ish. Now, one thing that I do want to bring out here for the RecOps, because this was something as you and I were talking whenever we first met. In my mind, whenever I hear RecOps, I'm thinking recruiting coordinator. I'm thinking an admin. I'm thinking someone who's helping me push the paper so I can get the job done. Please set the record straight for us. Even myself needed it reset because I think that we need to have a clear vision of what exactly we're talking about whenever we say RecOps.
No, and I think that that's a really good point because I think that that's something that as an industry and as a space that we are having to overcome because I think to a lot of people it's sort of, hey, RecOps is just admin, and if recruiting coordinators do admin, then RecOps must be admin and therefore blank. And it may have at one point in time been like that for like maybe a moment, and I say maybe for a moment because certainly there was a generation that came before in recruiting operations when it first kind of got started about 20 years ago, and it has evolved, and now we're sort of seeing this evolutionary push out of, and the Gen 1 group was sort of former heads of TA who were like, hey, I don't really want to be recruiting anymore, but this is where I have skills and I know how to set things up. So I'm going to do that. Or consultants that were doing the same thing as our tools got more and more sophisticated, and that grew how people were doing things. But now we're seeing this generation of recruiting ops folks that came out of being coordinators, and I think that has not actually helped that perception a lot because as your first introduction, you sort of maintain that memory of that person. And so if you started out as a coordinator, you kind of people keep coming back to you to do the coordinator things that you do. And I think recruiting operations folks, I wrote a post on this a couple of weeks or like last week or a couple of weeks ago. Brandon Wadley has also written a post about this too at a Noble Talent, which is, recruiting operations people have a hard time saying no. Because especially if you came up out of that coordinator mindset, you didn't get to say no very often. Or if you did, it was the tactical no where you had to present, hey, I know you want to do this, but, and then here's our solution to it, which distracted people from the no to what you actually wanted them to do. But I think when we start to answer your question even more directly, when we're talking about recruiting operations, we're essentially talking about 4 pillars. We're talking about operations, we're talking about programs, and that programs piece I'll dive into each one of those in a second. You've got data analytics, and then you've got strategy. And depending on where you're at, there's this kind of collective floating 5th pillar of employer branding. But each piece sort of covers a different thing, and coordination teams sometimes fall, depending on the structure of a company, fall underneath the operations team because they have to be so connected to everything else, and they have to kind of inform back to the ops team so we can see things we might not be seeing on our end. So that becomes kind of a piece to it. And yeah, I mean, I can dive into the pillars.
And Jeremy, I just want to stop you because I know we talked about these pillars before, but I want to keep employer brand in there because I think it's super important for people to understand what employer brand looks like. And this podcast is kind of built on employer brand and how we go to market and how do we understand how people understand who they're going to work for.
Yeah.
And who's going to be leading them, and so I think there's a huge piece, which by the way, when I was in my role in ops, was very much about that. It was about how do I craft the employer brand around it. But I want to go back to the operations piece because I do think there's a piece that I don't think people identify. It was what are we missing in that operations piece? What's happening? What's not happening?
Yeah, and I think that is something that is it's a very good question about what's happening in our operations piece, because I think the deeper you go into the operations pillar, sometimes people wonder if there's sort of, I'll call this like a pole shift. At a certain point in time, you're going so far north, you end up going south, kind of a deal. And that happens in recruiting ops, in the ops section, because what ends up happening is at a certain point in time, everything you're doing operationally ends up kind of informing strategy. And at a certain point, everything you're doing strategically is informed by what you're doing operationally. And so when this happens, it becomes a very interesting thing, because is it your strategy informs operations, or does your operations inform strategy? And where do you draw that line? And so what's happening kind of in the operational space, that's like our change management. And it's important, I think, to note, like, change management is very different than enablement. Those sometimes get used interchangeably.
Oh,
And
completely agree.
yeah.
Sign up.
So there are
Preach.
words that we're using and people sort of use them interchangeably as synonyms, and they're not. But all right, so in your operations pillar, you're having your technical, that's where you might have your like real technical pieces. So it's like your change management, your tools, your coordination teams, your tactical know-how, do-how in those pieces.
Okay, I have a question before
Sure.
we carry on. Would you say that it is more appropriate to kind of like, if someone's trying to summarize this type of role in their head, would you say this is like the HRIS role of talent? Like, these are the people who hold the systems, these are the people who oversee the efficiencies and what we use? Or kind of give us like, what corner should we be putting this in our brains of like what's similar?
Well, I think the closer parallel you have is actually the recruiting systems analysts.
Okay.
Because the thing with I don't think you get a perfect like recruiting systems is to HRIS analyst as recruiting operations is to people operations. Because and this is me kind of, I will say this, I don't like to speak to things that I don't know too much about, because one, I think that a lot of when people think that you're smart, people ask you to comment on everything. An abridged
But everybody thinks you're smart, Jeremy, so they want you to comment on everything.
I tell people, look, I pride myself on being the person in the room who's going to ask those questions that everybody thinks are obvious, because one, I see myself as eloquent. I certainly talk pretty one day, but me talk pretty one day, but I talk to people who are insanely bright all day long. And that's the minute you start to think you start to really truly believe in your own intelligence and believe that you're the smartest person in the room, is that you stop listening to other people who are a lot smarter than you. And that is something that I never wanted. The reason I preface this with that is that the the people operations side, that I think people think that the people team house is all like hunky-dory and everything like that. But what people don't really realize is the internal strife that sort of happens. So you see a lot of like, when companies are consolidating, they'll move the recruiting operations function underneath the people ops person. You don't necessarily see the people ops function getting decreased and moving underneath the recruiting operations function.
Yeah.
It's just something it's a transition you don't happen. So why is that? And I've posted that question to people. I've asked my people ops people, and sometimes I hear, well, it's like, well, but there are laws and stuff like that people ops needs to know that recruiting operations doesn't need to know. And it perpetuates this idea that everybody can learn recruiting, but not everybody can learn HR, failing to capitalize on the fact that there are a number of recruiting operations people. When our recruiters, when we're talking about internal mobility programs, when we're talking about anything that has to do with team makeup, diversity of a team, trying to understand where are their gaps, doing those skills mapping exercises, like, that's not necessarily something that most HR teams will handle. That's something that falls within the recruiting sphere of things. So if that's the case, then, what is it there? And I think that's why I'm always very, very, very specific to say that there is a difference there, and we have to think about that difference.
Absolutely. I mean, that is such good fonder. Like, I can go to sleep tonight, Jeremy, and be like, oh my God, Jeremy gave me those really great points. Because I think there is this kind of disconnect between what we understand as people ops, HR ops, rec ops, and I don't think we've all figured it out yet,
Yeah.
right? I remember when I got in my role, about now it's been 4 years or something like that, and in talent ops and rec ops, I don't think people had even figured out what my job descriptions. They were like, "You're going to do all these things," so that should be super important. But I do want to like shift and get into the programs moment of this because I think that's super important as well. And I guess I was, I was prepping for this and I wrote out some questions, but I would like you to talk to me about what you think the pillar means and how people can really think about that pillar.
Yeah, and I realized too in my getting on my soapbox a little bit there, I didn't actually address your question about employer branding, so I'll just very quickly do that, and then I'll talk about the program piece too, which is I think that on the recruiting operations side, one of the reasons why we end up getting employer brand sometimes and why many of us have become employer branding not experts but pay attention to it, talk to the folks like James Ellis and things like that, is that job descriptions are more than job descriptions, job adverts are more than job adverts, and most of the time recruiting teams don't have a dedicated marketing resource to be able to focus on those pieces. And so because RecOps usually is the foundational element, nothing can fall through us, we end up having to take on employer branding elements, much in the same way we have to take on our own L&D and we have to take on our own systems and our own engineering and all that stuff. I think recruiting is recruiting operations at TA Ops is much more of a MacGyver function where it's sort of like, hey, we need this to happen, but where does it go? And you're like, hey, like no one knows what I do. All I know is that what I do is important and I have to do all that. Now, talking about programs, I think that the programs pillar, when we think about that, there is a lot that goes into that. I mean, sometimes it's, hey, you're going to cover early careers and internships. You're going to do enablement. Again, you're doing the L&D for your team. That's a program. Referral programs, internal mobility programs. There is a lot that ends up getting fallen into that program initiative. But I think to what we've talked about earlier, if we think about kind of what older recruiting operations teams did, you had your recruiting operation manager, you had somebody that focused on the systems. So maybe you're recruiting systems analysts types. So that kind of covered your systems and your tactical operations. You had a program manager who sat underneath it, who focused on these program things. And now I think that that's been called talent management. It wasn't called talent management then, but I was a program manager in the TA ops space, and I focused on internal mobility and referrals and things like that.
Right.
Then you have a data analyst that is sitting there, you're recruiting data analyst. And then you had maybe the strategy piece was the manager of that team. And the more you talk to recruiting operations teams and the people who've come up, the further and further they get from hands-on work, and the more and more they start to kind of become a dashboard monkey. And when I talk to recruiting operations leaders, they're just like, I miss getting my hands dirty. I miss being in the mud. All of those things are all very interconnected, whether people like to believe it or not. And I think it's like when you're looking at your programs and you're looking at, let's go back to it, internal mobility or referrals, you have to know how that connects in your system. You have to know how referrals and internal mobility pieces are done in that system. You need to know what the data looks like. You need to know what the strategy looks like. You can't build in these like in these chambers anymore because all of the systems are connected at some point. And if you make a change in one spot, there's going to be downstream impacts. Like I can't just go in and change a source for something and not have people go, well, that was called this. Now we've got this. How are we merging this data together?
This episode is brought to you by DEI Labs, re-educating corporate America with immersive data-driven DEI training for HR and hiring pros. Ready to shift systems and spark real change? Visit DEI-labs.com to get started. Need a resume that actually works? Resume Writing is a female-owned team of recruiting pros helping job seekers land the roles they deserve. Get expert help at resumewriting.com.
Yeah. Ashley's done really good work in this space about building out systems and teams and processes, and but I also think it leads us a little bit into strategy. And Ashley, I don't want to cut you off if you have comments about the programs, but I do want to lead you to strategy because I think that's where your wheelhouse is, and we'd love to talk to you about that as well with Jeremy. So I'm really interested, Ashley, how you develop programs, how you develop in strategy, how you develop the data analytics that all tie together. Like, because I feel that is the missing piece. It's like the connection dots. If I could just make the little connection dot for everybody, I think that we would all be solid. But it just keeps me so separated. Am I wrong or am I right?
No, you're right. It's choppy, it's separated. And not only that, but one thing that as Jeremy was talking, I kept coming back to this because I know Jeremy's feels about data and analytics. And as I'm hearing him talk, I can't help but hear it seems like because so much of this is coupled under HR at some point, like that is eventually the head that it comes to. That group, in my opinion, has been so people-based that they have never valued data like we have. They might value turnover rates. They might value exit interview feedback, but they do not value data like we do. So to me, having someone who's an HR leader that can actually read data, interpret it from causation, correlation, and get that delineation, can then look at root cause analysis, draw out what the sources are, and then create process improvement and continuous improvement. That's not something I've ever seen happen out of HR. That has always been talent. And so that's also what I think leans to talent being a little bit more of a reactive sport, which it shouldn't be. It should be a proactive sport, but you can't get to proactivity till you know what you're dealing with, and that's where data comes from.
I mean,
I can't
I
make a
just
plan
want to
without
coin
it.
that whole moment. Mind blown. Just saying, mind blown. Jeremy, response to kind of that energy.
Jeremy's about to tell us nothing matters. He's
I
about
was
to
gonna
say,
be like,
forget it.
you are wrong. You don't matter. All of what you just said.
No, not at all.
No, I love it though. I'm glad that he's on this because
I love that I have the two of you on. It's amazing.
people listening, y'all, data and analytics is like my third child.
All right, look, here's the thing that is my feeling about data.
Oh, wow.
And
it's coming in hot.
Here it comes. My heart's gonna break. Okay.
I know. But I think before we get into that, I think that there's this thing to be here. I think that the way you phrase that makes it seem like I hate data.
You're right.
Data is terrible. And I want to be very clear. There is data that I like and there is data that I look at. And I wrote this as something I might put out later, but I think that there's a reason why recruiting and TA teams have had to look at data. And I think that that's because to a lot of people, they have put us in a box that is akin to sales. And sales is very metric heavy and sales is very, very delivered like that. And I think that that is ultimately one of the reasons why you might see TA teams talking about data a little bit differently than what you might see HR teams talking about data, because ultimately HR isn't compared to any other function in the same way that recruiting is. That's the case, then you're obviously going to be thinking about data. So like, does data for HR look a little bit more like product metrics? Are you looking at what's the output and like how close we are to delivery? Like, is that what we want to be looking at over there versus recruiting, which is sort of this front of the line kind of thing? And the quote that I wrote, and I'm happy to be wrong on it. I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong and why I'm wrong and where my thinking was wrong, because that's how I learned, was that ultimately, like when we go and we talk to the business doesn't care about time to hire or time to fill. Really what the business is caring about is time to production. So, but we present these two metrics to teams and go, isn't this great? We've reduced our time to hire by 10% and we've reduced our time to fill by 25%. Aren't these things great? And ultimately the question from the team goes, yeah, cool, I get the person quickly, but how quickly am I going to ramp them up to be able to do the things that I need them to do that are actually driving the
Oh
business?
my God, I think Ashley's about to come at your neck, Jeremy.
Challenge. Yes, I know. Desiree, we don't even need a transition. Here's my question. Of the 3 things that you listed, only 2 of them do we have influence on. Whenever they're ramping, whenever that is their manager, that's their efficacy check, not mine. So the efficacy check of the 2 other ones that you said that we do have control over are my quality of candidate and how dialed in are we assessing the right thing. Because if those 2 are telling us the right and they get the ramp or they don't, now we see where dysfunction is. So that's why I love data, because it can tell me where continued issues are and who has impact on what. Go ahead, tell me I'm wrong.
But really, we only have control over one of those things.
Time to fill or time to hire?
No, I mean, in terms of the one that you mentioned, because you mentioned quality of the candidate, right? And you mentioned, what was the second one?
Assessment. Well, quality we determine.
Well,
we say if they qualify or not. So that's also us too.
Well, but the thing about it is the question I would float back is, who makes the hire?
Manager plus talent influence.
All right.
However, who makes the pool? Me. So I'm not sending anyone over there that doesn't meet that first quality mark.
Well, but does talent actually make the pool though? Because the thing about it is that there are a lot of companies out there, major companies, that don't want to talk to inbound candidates. They only want to talk to sourced candidates.
Who's sourcing?
So if that's the case, then sure. But then there are companies who say, you know what, look, we've already built this swimming pool that we've put a whole bunch of people into. There are some companies who probably don't even need to go outside their walls. They can just simply say, look, we're a X-sized company. We're going to hire internally, blah, 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 blah. So the point here is that, like, really in that whole thing that recruiting would have a touch on, because how do we interpret quality on something where we're not training the person to do the job and we're going off of something else? But what we do have control over is our assessment mechanisms and the questions that we're asking to try and get to the hiring manager having the right resources to be able to say that this is a quality candidate. Because here's the other thing too that I'll throw out to you, which is recruiting has problems hiring recruiting operations people because recruiters think that they understand what recruiting operations does. Most of the time they don't. So what does that say? That even within our own thing, it becomes why is interviewing?
I agree. When I was in RecOps was different than when I was in RecOps before. It's all very different. And I think there needs to be a come to Jesus almost. And I hate to use Jesus in this terms, but yeah, in those moments.
Yep.
But I do want to end this and really make sure that we're responsible to you as a guest, and really loved having you. And we're definitely going to have you probably multiple times, because Ashley probably will kill me if we do not have you multiple times so she can argue all of her points.
No, I want to learn.
I know you do. So I'm excited, and he's been in my sphere for a long time, and so I know that he brings the value, and so I can't say enough about having you here. But I do want to ask you, came to me, when I was writing kind of out what we were going to do, and I think this is the most important question for me, and then we'll do some other things, but why should a CEO really care about RecOps? Why? Because I think that's the missing. So we get to this certain place in chief people officers and something else, but why should a CEO care about what RecOps is doing? Why does that matter?
I think that CEOs should care about your recruiting operations team, because ultimately it is what is going to lay the foundation for what your company looks like. I think that there's a viewpoint that recruiters find people, but RecOps builds everything behind the scenes. It's sort of like you don't go to a restaurant and talk totally about your experience, that the front of the house people are really what made the whole thing. You talk about the food. And that is where recruiting operations
Right.
shines. And really, your recruiting operations team, you could have, one person in your rec ops team and a phenomenal person at that, and they're going to 10x everybody else around them versus, a point solution. And so I think that's why people need to start caring about this, because the other piece too is we're the people that are going to be using AI in the most creative ways to try to save you money. And that is the thing too, that like
I think
recruiting
that's a really
operations
good
save
point.
people.
Let's touch on that a little bit clearer because we do have a little bit of time and I only have a couple of other questions. But I do think this AI, like Rec Ops and like how Rec Ops is going to be in the future of automation and AI is really important. Can you touch on that for us really quickly?
Yeah, and I mean it's changing. Like
Yeah.
that's the thing about AI right now is it's advancing so fast
Yeah.
that whatever I say right now, by the time you guys air this episode, it could be everything I say could be totally wrong. I think that one of the things about it is because recruiting operations are so TA ops folks are so close to the tech, we have to understand how the tech is working. And we're no longer just sort of sitting back and waiting on vendors to build the things that we want. There are many of us right now who are going out and building the things that, and we're AI enabled. And what you see right now is a lot of, I mean, Duolingo's CEO just announced this. Shopify's CEO said this a couple of weeks ago, which was the quiet part out loud, which is, all right, do we really need to add more people, or can we solve these problems with AI? And if that's the case, that has been what recruiting operations has been doing for the last 10 to 15 years, is thinking, how do I do more with less people and still get the same output and still understand the capacity planning and still understand all of these things? And that has become so core and fundamental to new and up and coming recruiting operations folks, because us Gen 2 and Gen 1 RecOps folks have been talking about it for so long that now we're starting to see where those steps are being made and
Yeah,
that impact is being
amazing,
felt.
amazing, amazing thoughts. Jeremy, I am so excited to have you on, but I also want you to plug anything that you've got going on right now. So this is the time. Please, where can people find you and how can they interact with you and what's the best way?
Yeah, so very active on LinkedIn. Always feel free to shoot me a message. I respond. Apologize if it gets buried, but I will respond and just shoot me another one and it'll be fine. RecOps.substack.com is how you can get in on my newsletter that is published every week. We just passed over 100 issues, which means that in 2 years when I started this, that I've only missed 4 times, which was wild to me. I mean, ultimately, RecOps Collective does do work. So if you have any recruiting operation needs, feel free to reach out to me at jeremy@recopscollective.com.
Oh my God, my friend, thank you so much for blessing us with your presence. I appreciate your time, and we will see you obviously in season 2.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me both.
Thank you so much. This is the part of our conversation where we go into stuff you didn't know before. Today we had on Jeremy Lyons, RecOps Collective, doing great work in the RecOps space. But now we're going to give you the psychological side of what we've been talking about. And so I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Ashley King. Please go forward.
All right. So today we have been learning about rec ops and how it is such a sexy sport and we all want to be a part of it and everyone loves data that's in it. And so and so today we're actually going to talk a little bit about research and data that was found in the era of 2020. So if you were recruiting in 2020, you know that we had a large job market shift and for the first time in a long time had a candidates market, meaning they were jurisdicting their pay and things like that. So what researchers found in that era of 2020 is that whenever candidates had multiple offers, that the offer that was given first, so the first company to offer, was traditionally over 70% more likely to get the acceptance than any of the other job offers that came later. And so essentially what these researchers were trying to thin out through their research is, does first to offer actually make an impact? Does the timing of the offer, does your efficiency in the talent process actually matter whenever all the offers are on the table to the candidate? And the answer was yes, that actually the first to commit to them actually did have a little bit of influence. So our efficiencies, our systems, our operations, our talent in general, and how well we can move through things really can play a role as far as timing goes. So there's some stuff you didn't know before.
I'm Desiree.
And I'm Ashley. And thanks for listening to Talentless, where we keep it real in the world of HR.
If you loved what you heard, don't forget to hit subscribe and give us a follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We're here to keep your feed packed with everything you need to level up in recruitment and HR.
And be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And hey, don't miss out. Sign up for our newsletter for fresh insights and follow us on socials to stay connected with both Ashley and me.
Thanks again for joining us on Talentless. Until next time, we'll see you then.